Well, welcome everybody. This is a roundtable discussion with a panel of interesting and interested members of the Animal Alliance of Canada to talk about a subject that I think really haunts not only people who are involved in doing research on what goes on in research facilities, but I think of great concern to anybody who's interested in animals, which is the whole question of animals in research laboratories, and is it necessary that animals be sacrificed in this particular way? My name is Erica Ritter. I'm a volunteer at the Animal Alliance of Canada and also involved in working with these excellent people on developing documents that are informative and interesting and maybe might motivate change in some of these areas. And with me are first of all, let me introduce, because I'm only meeting him today for the first time, Jordan Reichert, who is the West Coast Campaign Officer for the Animal Alliance. And also with me is Verena Besso, who is a volunteer, another extraordinary researcher, and Twyla Francois, who is the Humane Cosmetics Researcher for the Animal Alliance of Canada. And of course, the person who makes it all happen is Liz White, the director. So we're going to just talk about various aspects of some of these issues. And I'll start it off because my own background area is both in writing and also in media. And I'm extremely aware and increasingly aware of the extent to which there is this widening gap between what the average person in Canada who has any sensitivity whatsoever to any of these issues feels, and what is still current in the research community and the way it's reported in media. For example, there was a recent poll that showed that only 25% of Canadians approved of the use of animals in research or in whatever aspect of research it was, any kind of experimentation, product development, and so on. And another poll was done by Marco Canseco of the Canseco Research Company, and he said it's clear that animal welfare is an issue where the market decides, even in the absence of carefully crafted legislation, because 1 in 4 residents of the 3 most populous provinces are not in favor of consuming animals, and most Canadians express dismay at wearing fur garments. So, maybe people don't always act on these impulses, but this is what they believe. However, this is versus the mindset of researchers who are still assuming that using animals is the only way to do research, even if the data thereby gotten or the drugs developed are completely irrelevant, useless, turn out not to match up to expectation from the preclinical trial to the trials with humans that come later. And yet, even though other countries are developing non-animal methods for alternatives to animals in the laboratory, there's this kind of persistency in the Canadian research world that this is the only way this can happen. I personally think from reading media that that mindset is promoted as well, or accepted in a completely non-questioning way by reports. If you pick up a newspaper, the Globe and Mail, whatever, Vancouver Sun, whatever paper it happens to be, you may find that the media simply says, studies done with mice or preclinical trials with animals, as though, again, that's first of all inevitable, and secondly going to be valuable. And there's no sort of internal dissection of what that means, the efficacy of it. I mean, there's almost no curiosity. It's almost an article of faith that this is how it has always been, therefore must always be. So I think that mindset is certainly a relevant component of what we're talking about today. And I'm going to turn first to Liz White, who has been exploring, issues in terms of research, issues in terms of engagement with the rules and the breaking of the rules in Canada both at the Canadian Council on Animal Care and also in the many, many facilities that exist across this country, just to get her view of what I've said and what she's found.
Thank you, Erica. So I've been working on this issue since the mid-1980s, and in 1990, when we formed Animal Alliance, one of the first campaigns we ran was to get the Ontario government to stop requiring the sale of dogs and cats that were people's lost pets that ended up in pounds and shelters from being used in research. And they were used in pretty high numbers at that time. And I thought to myself, well, this will be an easy campaign because this is about dogs and cats. These are people these are animals that have been formerly in somebody's home, obviously beloved, and ended up in a shelter for a variety of different reasons. And boy, was I mistaken, because we're now sitting here in 2022 and the same issue exists and the same research requirements exist in Ontario. And it wasn't until we really started again looking at this issue in 2017 that we realized how many barriers there were to the issue. Not just getting the information, but actually protecting animals in research laboratories. Even if they were in research laboratories, how do we protect them? And what I think the research has discovered that there is really no protection for animals in Canada in research laboratories. And even worse than that is that the numbers of animals that are used in research laboratories in Canada is going up, not down. So clearly, even though there has been this program called the 3 Rs, where you try and refine your research, you try and reduce the numbers of animals used, or you try and replace them with some non-animal process, that in fact, that's really not happening in Canada at all, because the numbers of animals are going up, not down.
Okay, and Verena, because you have done all this delving into the Canadian Council on Animal Care and other, facts and statistics about what goes on in the laboratories of Canada that involve animals, you're the logical person to pick up where Liz left off.
Well, okay, Erica, if you say so.
I do.
So the Canadian Council on Animal Care is an organization that I'm pretty sure the vast majority of Canadians are entirely unaware of. It's a supposedly it's a nonprofit organization that sits in Ottawa and is comprised of, for the most part, researchers themselves and the funding bodies that provide the public funds, for the most part, into research in Canada. And it supposedly makes sure that animals are used in the most ethically possible manner in Canada. But the way it does that is it has promulgated voluntary guidelines, and research facilities are encouraged. That's actually some of the language still used at the CCAC, encouraged to adhere to the guidelines. There are no penalties should they not adhere to the guidelines. There are very, very long timelines for improvement of guidelines. Most recently, some of the rodent housing recommendations, which allowed for a slightly larger habitat for the rodents that are used in research. The Canadian Council on Animal Care decided that the research facilities need at least until 2031 to meet those guidelines. So very minimal protections for animals once they have reached the laboratory setting. And I think that's why much of our efforts should go into replacing the use of animals with human-centered methods. But be that as it may, the situation that we have right now is what it is. And not only does it fail to protect the animals, it also sets up layers and barriers and walls of secrecy such that it's very, very difficult to get specifics about what goes on. And I think everyone's aware that in today's information-driven age, data is the main ammunition in almost any campaign. And when we're talking about animals used in research in Canada, getting data is excruciatingly difficult. This Canadian Council on Animal Care itself is not governed by any freedom of information or access to information legislation. Their findings, their assessments, their reports are confidential. The small crack in the wall, if you will, as far as legislated freedom of information, governs Ontario research facilities, which fall under the Animals for Research Act in Ontario. This is an act that doesn't protect animals. It provides for the sources of animals. It again has guidelines as to how animals in laboratories are to be kept, housing, cage sizes, that kind of thing. And one thing it does provide is inspection of research facilities and access to those inspection reports under freedom of information legislation in Ontario. But that being said, once we go through the process, we at Animal Alliance have been doggedly, I think doggedly is a good word, going for freedom of information and access to information reports for many, many years. It is a very, very difficult process. The information that comes to us after much effort, after appeals, sometimes where the information is denied and we appeal it and we finally get it, it comes to us in a form that is redacted such that the kinds of animals being used, the names of the facilities, lots of specific information is redacted. So this is brought to the attention of the Privacy Office, and one of the more recent responses from the Privacy Office was, well, you should be able to figure out what report goes with what inspection in the majority of cases, because they obviously feel that it's not important to provide accurate information. So that's just one example. That it's an egregious example. It's laughable when you read that response. You should be able to figure out most of the time, what more do you want? So that's a really good illustration of how difficult it is. Nonetheless, we're going to persevere because it is so important to get a good handle, or as good a handle as possible, on what actually goes on. And just to finish what I've said, once you dig through the redactions and try to match A with B, you find that even minimal regulations supposedly on the functioning of animal care committees, and we'll hear more about them lately, are not met. We have quoted inspection reports, quotes in the inspection reports saying, as per the previous inspection, and sometimes this will be 3 years in the past, same issues are still ongoing. So the situation in Ontario, we have a small glimpse into, we don't believe that the other provinces there's no reason to believe that things are better in the other provinces, but in Ontario, we've got a better glimpse into how poorly the system in Canada is failing the animals in research and testing and training.
Yes, and laughable, perhaps, but also infuriating, right? When you're trying to delve for information, and it's almost as if deliberate obstacles are being put up to prevent that from happening, and you have to ask, what is it they don't want us to see? And I guess nowhere is that more evident, Twyla, than when you're looking at these animal care committees, which function on the ground to supposedly ride herd on these all these various facilities and make sure they're adhering to all the guidelines and so on. So what's your experience been?
Right. So yeah, it's pretty much what Verena found and worse, unfortunately. So the example that I'm looking at is mostly in Alberta. So this again was a number of access to information requests that Animal Alliance did many years ago, because again, it took years and years of appeals and processing to try to get the results from these requests. And this was to a federal department that uses animals extensively in some of the most pain-inducing experiments possible. And they have numerous research facilities across the country. And one thing that was shocking to find out was that in all of these facilities that they have across the country doing these horrendous experiments, they have just one animal care committee that reviews all of the protocols across the country. I should probably explain the grunting you're hearing. That's this guy. Sorry, he loves Zoom calls. He just conks out during them. So if you're hearing snoring, it's him. Sorry about that.
No, he's taking notes. He's taking notes. It's good.
He is, yes. So some of the things that we found, and again, yeah, there's tons of redactions. It's a lot of just reading between the lines and trying to figure out, piecing together things. It's like if they threw a pile of papers in the air and trying to piece it together. But during one 8-year period, we documented gross misconduct by this animal care committee. We found cases of horribly painful experiments that were repeated over and over again, often without any change in experimental design or rationale for redoing them at all. We found that, like Liz said, these animal care committees are supposed to be, critiquing why this number of animals were used. They're supposed to be implementing the 3 Rs, asking if alternatives can be used, if fewer animals can be used. In this case, the committee members are routinely recommending that more animals be used, that an additional control group of animals be used, even when there's completely no logical reason to do so. And it was often such an embarrassing fact, the researchers themselves had to point it out, that with the nerve agents that were being tested, it has a 100% fatal rate. So it makes absolutely no point to add a control group. They would all just die. And in one of probably the most egregious cases, in response to a researcher who was amending a protocol to allow him to revive pigs after exposing them to toxic nerve agents and put them through a battery of neurobehavioral tests for 7 days. One animal care committee member actually suggested the researcher go even further and withhold pain relief and deny euthanizing them, even if they're suffering too terribly to continue. This is the kind of decisions that are being made by the people that are the final line of protection for these animals. Yet this body was being assessed by the Canadian Council on Animal Care every 3 years. No problems were noted. They continually were given their certificate of good animal practice. And this is the standard that's being held in Canada. It's horribly shocking, and we need to do something.
Well, yeah, and Jordan, I know these stories and others just as awful are very familiar to you. Your work, your own research and study into these things. But part of the job of the Animal Alliance, I think, is to enlist people for what people outside of the immediate organization, the people who are looking through these horrendous stats, what people could do to change this or to protest it. And what are your thoughts about this because of your own, active role?
Yeah, well, it's a terrible tragedy that we're still here today dealing with these issues. And it's one of those things that I think at the very beginning, what we started with saying is that not many people actually know that they're happening. They go on sort of in the dark halls of private laboratories and academia, and there's opportunities to educate people in those places, but there's kind of an old guard mentality to just keep things the way they are, keep using animals, even if the research is poor, even if the results are poor, even if alternatives exist. There's very little push. And part of that both is at the level of the people doing the research, but also at the level of government and the public as well. So, the public as a starting point need to educate themselves, and that's why the work that is being done around exposing the CCAC, pets being used in research in Ontario and other places, in military trauma training, all those things that Animal Alliance has been working on for a very long time. People need to know. And so, sharing the word, sharing those campaigns is really kind of the first step a lot of people can take, but educating themselves, because some of those people might be students. They might be students going to universities where they're learning about how to experiment on animals. Maybe they know people. Maybe they're going to talk to politicians, MLAs, MPs, and even city councillors, and educate them, because if the public's not aware, then the government officials who ultimately are made up of the public probably didn't hear about this when they first got into their role in government, because animal issues just generally are largely underrepresented, and certainly animals in laboratories, which is often sort of excused or considered untouchable because of this idea that the animals and they use this term, which I think is a terrible term to use, but sacrifice is for our benefit. And so there's some sort of utilitarian argument that yes, the animals have to suffer, but ultimately it's better for us. But the research doesn't show that it's actually benefiting humanity much at all. In fact, it's probably holding humanity back from development of cures, and that would be more based on human models of understanding and using human materials to move forward. People can, of course, reach out to their MLAs and MPs, send them the information that we've developed. There's some fantastic packages here that they need to be aware of, because once it's in their mind, then it'll just come up. They'll say, oh, I remember hearing something about that. And although animals traditionally haven't been a major part of our political systems or political discourse, that is slowly changing. We are slowly seeing animal issues coming to the forefront. We have some animal issues in the mandate letters of some of the ministers right now, and so we can see some progress coming down. But we have to be able to understand how it's sort of a systemic exploitation of animals manifests at all levels. Accountability is huge, because right now there's really no accountability for the CCAC or these other government bodies that or the people who are experimenting on animals, unless people raise the call to action. So that's what the main things people can do, I would say, is support the campaigns. Go out and get a meeting with your MLA, get a meeting with your MP, let your city councillors, let all these people know what is happening in their districts, right, in their regions. And when you see new developments like there were in Vancouver recently with a new like with UBC developing new laboratories, or one of the local hospital societies developing new laboratories, go and bring that to city council, because they're the ones who give permits in many cases for these types of things to happen. And so try to stop it before it starts, if you have that opportunity. Ultimately it's up to us to just give animals that representation that they are desperate for, that they are calling out for, that they are silenced from being able to provide for themselves because of the places where these atrocities take place. And that's the best we can do, and it may not feel like a lot always, and it may not always be successful, but if we don't try, then we're failing them, and I think we're failing ourselves.
Well, one thing that kind of goes back to what I was quoting initially from this poll, this Canseco poll, that somehow, in spite of everything you're saying and everything we're all saying about how there's a cult of secrecy, there's a purposeful attempts to keep information from being disseminated without redaction, and so on. And somehow, in spite of everything, the public seems to have some instinct about this. And I wonder what the rest of you think of it, because as the man says, Mr. Canseco, it's clear that animal welfare is an issue where the market decides, even in the absence of carefully crafted legislation. There's a kind of instinctual thing. I mean, nobody told, 3/4 of the population to be uncomfortable with the idea of animals in laboratory. And yet it seems they are.
I thought I would just add to that, Erica, and what Jordan said, because I believe that there is a growing discomfort with people who work in research laboratories, particularly people who are the caregivers to the animals who are being used for research. And you have to ask yourself, in a facility that uses 300,000 fish or 150,000 mice, how an animal caregiver in that facility could possibly cope with really giving good animal care. And we know from the inspection reports that in fact they can't. In one, for example, where we have these large banks of mice, the inspection reports asked, where is the ladder in the facility, so that they could see the numbers of animals, what was the condition of the animals in the top, and did they get down on their hands and knees to see them down in the bottom? So what I would say above and beyond what Jordan said is to reach out to anybody who is working in a research facility to call us. If there are things that need to be reported, call us. We acted on the information that we got about the Arkell research facility, where somebody went in and documented the condition that pigs and chickens were being kept in at the University of Guelph, the top agricultural college in Canada, and conditions of animals there were utterly appalling. And it took somebody on the inside to actually document it and then send those pictures out publicly. And we took those pictures and laid a complaint. Now, we couldn't get any information about what actually happened. We complained to the ministry in Ontario, and they wouldn't tell us what happened. We complained to the CCAC, put in a written report to both of those entities, and the CCAC said that unless the University of Guelph wanted to share the report, we were not to be privy to it. So at the end of the day, we could never find out what actually happened. But the fact that somebody did that meant that it opened up the window into that facility to show people what really happens to animals in research laboratories, and the disregard for their comfort and welfare was so apparent in that particular facility. So if anybody has the courage to call us, please do, because we'll follow up.
And any other thoughts about this, about the public's role, or what people seem eager to know about these subjects?
Well, I find that poll that you were citing from Erica very interesting, because I have always felt that under the impression that most people are true believers in the necessity of using animals for research. They feel that it's a toss-up between their own or their human loved one's health and an animal, and it's sad that the animal has to be used, but there's no other way. And perhaps there is a sense that people have been reading and educating themselves that there are other ways to develop treatments and potential cures for human ailments that don't involve animals. Because I always felt it was our largest challenge is to educate people into the fact that human-centered research is the way to go forward, that that humans are not 100 kilogram versions of mice, and the things that are developed with a mouse model. And you actually read that in many of the media reports. Well, these results are promising, but you got to remember that humans are not mice. So, but just to circle back again to where you started, Erica, if there is that notion trickling down from somewhere that this is not necessarily the be all and end all, then I think that's a reason for hope.
And also I was going to say, I think it's the reason why we're having so much trouble getting information is because I think the researchers sense that there's a real extreme discomfort with what's happening. So if they can shut down all discussion about what goes on in research laboratories, if they can deny us the information, then how do you have that discussion? It's really difficult. So I think, the digging that we do and this discomfort are coming together quite nicely, and we may see some real change.
And there's also, I think, the question of just the sort of the hierarchy of science. I mean, that comes out so much in what people who have been on animal care committees in the capacity of representing the public have said, that there's a hierarchy where even veterinarians are afraid to challenge the researchers about the humanity or the inhumanity of their research on animals. And I think also in school, I mean, Jordan mentioned, students who are in courses. It's hard. We all know of veterinary students who have objected to, live surgeries, especially terminal surgeries, who have plumped for the replacement of live animals with either even cadavers, or better yet, better computer models. But it's really hard when you're in a position, in a hierarchy to challenge authority, especially when there are grades at stake or your future at stake. And I think for the scientists, they sort of want it both ways. I mean, as Liz says, there's this cult of secrecy, but on the other hand, one of the internal documents that was in the report on the CCAC that Verena and I had worked on, there's kind of plaintiveness of scientists. Why don't people appreciate what we do? Well, because you don't want them to see it. That's why. You want the glory that accrues from the great discovery, but you don't want anybody to know how that came about. It's like the old thing about politics and sausages. Neither one should you see them being made, and there's all that too, I think.
Yeah, and I think just, we have to recognize that, money is a huge part of it at the end of the day. There's very significant lobby groups who want to continue animals being used in research. And the way that academia runs is about funding. It's all about getting grants. It's all about funding research. And unless you're using animals, you're not going to get that funding right now. And the government provides almost no funding or no funding for people doing alternatives to animal research. So until the money changes direction, I think that it's going to continue to be an uphill battle. But there's something else I want to kind of recognize towards Liz, what Liz mentioned about the undercover sort of exposés that we've seen, whether it's at Arkell or whether it's in some of the private laboratories. It's that these are learned behaviors. These are power dynamics and learned behaviors of people. When you put vulnerable animals in a situation where people know that they're not exposed in any way, any scrutiny. There's no accountability. They can do whatever they want to these animals. They're going to abuse that power if it's available to them. And a part of that is what is passed down, and it doesn't matter what you call it, if you call it a sacrifice or killing or euthanizing or murder. It's that we teach people that it's okay to treat animals these way, but we can also teach people that it's not okay. We can teach people that alternatives exist, that better science exists, and that a better world exists where they don't have to do these things to get the grades that they want or get into the universities they want or to get the funding that they want. And that's what this really is all about, is about creating an alternative narrative to the dominant one that people are forced to buy into in many cases, whether it's through the socialization of us in believing that animals, that good science or research has to include animals, or that the health of humanity is somehow at stake without them in it. It's just not the truth. Just like the dairy industry or cigarettes or all these other things. It's about creating an alternative narrative that actually brings forward the truth and challenges the ways that we've been doing things for a very long time without good justification. And I'm really excited about what that future can look like.
I actually really like that example because we found that to be the case at the University of Guelph on the live terminal surgery issue that we did way back in about 2010, because one of the students there said, "I'm not going to kill my dog." Of the 40 students that were there that were doing a spay and neuter on 40 purpose-bred beagles, all of them destined to be killed at the end of the spay neuter. One student said, "No, I'm not going to do it." She risked her $10,000 work at the University of Guelph because of that particular situation. But it was because she stood up and said no and succeeded that the next year there were students who decided that they didn't want to participate in that either. So you're absolutely right, Jordan. Having people who feel comfortable enough to talk out, I think, gives courage to other people to say, "No, I'm totally uncomfortable with this, and I'm not going to do it," and still graduate.
Yeah, and in that case, those were foreign trained veterinarians trying to get their Canadian accreditation in this program offered at the University of Guelph. And a lot was riding on, they had to purchase the dogs, if I remember,
Yes.
Themselves, and they also had to kill the dog themselves. And for this young woman to speak out as she did, I mean, not only was she $10,000, but it was also, a future as a practitioner in Canada, and that's incredible.
And just to add, the year after that, so she was 1 year, we saved the beagles the next year. And then the year after that, we had a group of students reach out to us and say that the university was going to do the same thing with the sheep. And so we were able to rescue 30 sheep out of that program. And with the help of with a shelter, that we were able to place those animals in homes, and they were just wonderful animals. And it just meant that it gave people courage for over 3 years in that program to say, let's do something different here.
Well, this conversation clearly is only the beginning of an extremely complicated and painful on the one hand, but also, as we've all said in one way or another, there are these promising aspects. I mean, there is only hope. That's the only thing there is to go on. And I think we've touched on a lot of things that I'm sure we'll explore further in other detail. But for now, thank you all so much for your contribution to this conversation and for the work you do, really.
Thank you all.
Thank you.